With trembling hands, Emily placed the pen to paper, and as the ink began to flow, a single tear fell, smudging the signature that would change all their lives forever. But before we begin, I want to ask you something. Are you ready to hear a story that might change the way you see life? If your answer is yes, then let's begin right now. The rain lashed against the tall glass panes of Callahan Tower, each drop striking like tiny fists of discontent. The city skyline outside was veiled in a curtain of gray, as though the heavens themselves mirrored the unease simmering within. Inside the dimly lit office, John Callahan sat motionless behind a desk that seemed to stretch into eternity. The room was an epitome of power. Mahogany shelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound books, a testament to generations of wealth and ambition. But tonight, it felt less like an empire and more like a gilded cage. John's fingers traced the edge of his late father's will, the paper yellowed yet sharp, cutting deeper than any blade. He read the clause again, its words like a noose tightening around his neck. The inheritance will be awarded to the first legitimate heir. Should none exist, it will be divided among the shareholders. His jaw clenched, the weight of his solitude pressing against his chest. The empire his family had built brick by brick, Callahan Industries, now dangled precariously, dependent on a condition he could not fulfill. I have dedicated my life to this empire, but without an heir it will all be for nothing. John's internal monologue echoed in the cavernous silence of the room. The ticking of the antique clock on the wall felt more accusatory with every passing second, each tick a reminder of time slipping away. The office door creaked open, breaking his trance. Emily Turner, his assistant of 5 years, entered carrying a stack of meticulously prepared financial reports. Her presence was like a gust of fresh air, brisk and efficient, yet tinged with an unspoken wariness. Emily, with her impeccable suits and ever-steady demeanor, had become the backbone of John's professional life. Yet, tonight, even her usual composure seemed frayed at the edges. "Here are the financial reports you requested, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice calm but lacking its usual confidence. "Thank you, Emily," John replied, his tone flat, his eyes lingering on her longer than usual. She set the papers down and hesitated for a moment, her gaze darting to the ominous document on his desk. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" she asked, sensing his unease but knowing better than to pry. "Oh, that will be all." John's reply was curt, but as she turned to leave, his voice softened. "Emily, thank you." She paused briefly, startled by the rare vulnerability in his tone, but left without a word. As the door closed behind her, John leaned back in his chair, the shadows on the ceiling casting jagged patterns that seemed to mock him. Across town, in a modest apartment cluttered with medical bills and fading photographs, Emily slumped onto the couch. Her husband, Michael, lay in their bedroom, his once strong frame now frail and thin, his illness a relentless thief stealing him away piece by piece. Emily clutched her phone, scrolling through hospital invoices and treatment options that were far beyond their reach. Her hand trembled as she tapped the screen, the numbers blurring together. Michael's voice called weakly from the bedroom. She hurried to his side, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How are you feeling today, Michael?" she asked, her voice soft but strained. "We both know we can't afford more treatments, Em," he replied, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "You don't have to keep doing this." Her heart ached, torn between despair and an unyielding determination. "Don't say that. We'll find a way, I promise." But as she kissed his forehead and turned off the bedside lamp, she knew her promises were as fragile as glass. The following morning, Emily arrived at the office earlier than usual, her eyes shadowed from another sleepless night. She found John standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette framed by the pale morning light. "Emily," he began, his voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "I need to discuss something with you. Sit down." The gravity of his tone sent a ripple of anxiety through her, but she complied. He turned to face her, his expression inscrutable. "I'll be direct," he said, his words as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "I need you to have a child for me." The air between them froze, the words hanging like a thundercloud. Emily blinked. Sure, she had misheard him. "Excuse me? I must have misunderstood you," she said, her voice laced with incredulity. John's gaze didn't waver. "This is a professional arrangement. No emotional complications, no personal expectations, just a contract. In return, I'll cover all your financial burdens, your husband's medical bills, your debts, everything." Emily's breath caught in her throat, a cascade of emotions crashing over her. Shock, confusion, and an inkling of something darker. I don't know what to say," she stammered. John continued, his voice unyielding. "We both know this is the most efficient solution. You need financial security, I need an heir. This is business, nothing more." That evening, Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hands gripping a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. Michael's soft snores drifted from the bedroom, a reminder of the life they had built together, a life now teetering on the edge of ruin. Could I really bring a child into the world this way? What would happen to my marriage if Michael found out? Her thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm, each question cutting deeper than the last. She glanced at a stack of unpaid bills, their presence an incessant reminder of her reality. Michael had always been her rock, but now the roles had reversed and the weight was suffocating. When Michael stirred in the bedroom, she forced herself to go to him. "It's just been a long day, Michael," she said when he asked about her weary expression. "Nothing to worry about." As you lay awake beside him, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, the enormity of her decision loomed like a specter in the darkness. The next morning, Emily stepped into John's office, her expression unreadable. He looked up from his desk, his piercing gaze meeting hers. "I accept," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. John nodded, his expression calm but betraying a flicker of relief. "Good, I knew you would. The agreement will be formalized soon." As Emily left the room, a part of her felt as though she had crossed an invisible threshold, stepping into a world she could never return from. The rain had stopped outside, but the storm within her was far from over. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. The light from a single lamp cast a pale, golden glow across the room, softening its harsh edges, but doing little to comfort Emily's frazzled mind. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands cradling a cooling cup of chamomile tea, though its calming effects eluded her tonight. Her eyes were fixed on the stack of bills piled haphazardly on the table's corner, their presence as suffocating as the walls closing in around her. Emily's gaze drifted to the bedroom door, where Michael lay asleep. She imagined his thin frame cocooned in the blankets, the rise and fall of his chest uneven, each breath a quiet battle. She wanted to go to him, to hold him, to whisper reassurances she didn't believe herself. But the weight of the decision she had made earlier that day anchored her to the chair, the distance between them an impassable chasm. Her thoughts were a labyrinth, winding and dark, each path leading her back to the same question: what have I done? The kitchen table seemed colder beneath her fingertips as her mind replayed the moment in John's office. His voice had been steady, detached, almost clinical, as he laid out his proposition. But his words had struck her with the force of a gale, leaving her breathless and unmoored. I need you to have a child for me. It's a professional arrangement. No emotional complications, no personal expectations." She had heard the offer, understood its logic, and yet, deep within her, a flicker of indignation had burned. Was that all she was to him? A solution to a problem? A means to an end? And yet, hadn't she said yes? The guilt clawed at her, relentless and sharp. Michael's face swam in her mind, his kind eyes now dimmed with exhaustion. The faint smile he always gave her, despite the pain he endured. He had always been her anchor, her safe harbor in life's storms. And now she was betraying him, in a way he might never forgive. The apartment's air felt heavy and oppressive, as though it carried the weight of her guilt. Emily rose from the table, her legs trembling beneath her, and wandered to the living room window. The city outside was alive with light and movement, cars weaving through the streets like fireflies caught in a frantic dance. The world continued unabated, blissfully unaware of the storm raging within her. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass, her breath fogging the surface as she closed her eyes. In her mind, two opposing forces waged war. One was her practical side, the part of her that had always found solutions, that reminded her of Michael's mounting medical bills, the doctors who had given them only weeks before cutting off treatment. The other was the part of her that clung fiercely to her morality, her dignity, and the love she bore for her husband. "I'm doing this for him," she told herself for the 100th time that evening. "For us." But the words rang hollow, a brittle excuse that cracked under the weight of her shame. Time stretched and warped as she stood there, the moments bleeding into one another. She thought of the life that might come from this arrangement. A child born not from love but from desperation. Their existence tied irrevocably to a decision made in the shadows of financial ruin. Would they grow up resenting her? Would they sense the unspoken truth lingering between her and John? The thought of John sent another pang of confusion through her. He had always been distant, methodical, and coldly professional. But in the quiet moments during their conversation, she had caught glimpses of vulnerability, of a man burdened by his own loneliness and need for legacy. It had been unsettling, almost disarming, and now, in the stillness of her apartment, she found herself questioning what had driven him to this point. Was his desperation so different from hers? The thought frightened her. It humanized him in a way that made her decision feel even more treacherous. Give this video a like if you find it helpful. It means a lot to me. Emily turned away from the window, her reflection ghost-like against the dark glass. She walked toward the bedroom, her steps slow and deliberate, each one heavier than the last. Michael was still asleep when she entered, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the bedside lamp. She stood by the door for a moment, watching him, her heart aching at the sight. He deserves to know the truth, she thought. But the words caught in her throat, choked by the fear of his reaction. Michael, who had given her nothing but love and trust, would see this as a betrayal. And wasn't it? She moved to his side, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. He stirred slightly, his lips parting in a soft murmur. "Emily," he whispered, his voice filled with warmth, even in sleep. It was too much. She felt the tears spill over, hot and unrelenting, carving paths down her cheeks. The hours dragged on as Emily lay beside him, her eyes fixed on the cracks in the ceiling. The room felt suffocating, the darkness pressing against her like a living thing. Her mind wouldn't quiet, replaying the events of the day, each moment etched with agonizing clarity. Her decision felt like a betrayal of everything she had built with Michael, yet she couldn't see another way forward. The bills wouldn't stop coming, the treatments wouldn't pay for themselves, and Michael's condition would only worsen without them. But at what cost? She had stepped onto a path that felt irreversible, and the thought of where it might lead terrified her. Would she lose Michael? Would she lose herself? The clock on the nightstand glowed faintly, its hands inching toward dawn. Emily felt a hollow ache in her chest, the kind that came from knowing that nothing would ever be the same. When the first light of morning seeped through the blinds, Emily rose from the bed, her movements slow and heavy. Michael stirred, his eyes fluttering open as she kissed his cheek. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft but strained. "I'll make us some coffee." As she moved toward the kitchen, the weight of her decision followed her, an invisible chain she would carry into the days ahead. The apartment was quiet again, but the storm within her raged on, louder than ever. The office felt colder than usual, the air heavy with unspoken tension. John Callahan sat at his desk, the afternoon light casting sharp shadows across his face. His usual composure, a veneer of control cultivated over years of boardroom battles, felt tenuous, fraying at the edges. Across from him, Emily Turner sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her brows drawn together in a storm of confusion and disbelief. The silence between them stretched unbearably, punctuated only by the soft hum of the air conditioner. John broke it first, his voice firm, but edged with something almost imperceptible: vulnerability. "This isn't easy for me to say," he began, his eyes meeting hers with uncharacteristic directness, "but I need you to understand that this is purely practical." Emily blinked, the weight of his words settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Practical. The word rang in her ears, cold and impersonal, as though what he was asking of her was no more significant than filing a report or organizing his schedule. But the enormity of his proposition loomed in the space between them, undeniable and intrusive. "You need me to have your child," she repeated, her voice hollow. It wasn't a question, but an effort to ground herself in the surreal reality of what he had just proposed. "As part of a business arrangement?" John nodded, leaning forward slightly. The movement brought him into the light, his sharp features softened by the golden glow. For the first time, Emily noticed the strain in his expression, the faint lines etched around his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. He wasn't just a powerful man making an unorthodox demand. He was a man standing on the precipice of desperation. "Yes," he said simply. His tone was steady, but Emily caught the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "I don't have time to find a conventional solution. You know my situation. Without an heir, everything my family built will be divided among shareholders. It will be meaningless." His words were deliberate, calculated, but Emily couldn't ignore the undercurrent of emotion that betrayed him. She leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. "And you thought I would just agree to this? That I'd say yes without hesitation?" John's lips pressed into a thin line. "I thought you would at least consider it. I'm offering you a solution to your own problems, Emily. Your husband's medical bills, the stress that's been eating at you for years. This arrangement benefits us both." Emily's hands tightened into fists in her lap, her nails digging into her palms, his words cut deeply. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She hated that he had seen through her so easily, that he knew exactly how close she was to breaking. But that didn't make his proposition any less audacious. "Do you even hear yourself?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "You're asking me to bring a child into the world for a paycheck. You think that's something I can just decide on over a cup of coffee?" John's jaw clenched, his frustration barely contained. "I'm not asking you to do this lightly," he said, his voice sharper now. "I wouldn't even consider it if I didn't think you were the right person for this. You're intelligent, responsible, and discreet. I trust you, Emily." The words hung in the air, unexpected and disarming: trust. Emily hadn't realized how much weight that single word could carry until she heard it from him. But even as her heart softened slightly, her mind rebelled. This was madness. She had a life, a husband. How could he think this was a reasonable request? The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing that coiled tighter with every passing second. Emily's thoughts swirled in chaotic loops, her emotions clashing violently with her sense of logic. She glanced down at her hands, the pale scars on her knuckles, a reminder of all the battles she had fought to keep her life afloat. Could she really sacrifice her principles for the sake of survival? "I don't understand you," she said finally, her voice quieter now but no less strained. "You have everything, John: money, power, influence. Why does this air mean so much to you?" John leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to the large window behind her. The city skyline stretched endlessly, a sea of ambition and chaos. For a moment he seemed lost in it, his expression unreadable. "You think I have everything?" he said softly, almost to himself. "But without an heir, none of it means anything. My father built this empire from nothing. He poured his life into it, and I've done the same. If I don't find a way to continue his legacy, it all dies with me, and I can't accept that." His words were spoken with conviction, but Emily heard the cracks beneath them. There was a weight in his voice, a burden that went beyond mere business. It was about pride, yes, but also about fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of leaving nothing behind. She felt a pang of sympathy, unbidden and unwelcome. She had always seen John as unshakable, a man who thrived on control, but now, in the raw honesty of his confession, she saw something else: vulnerability, even loneliness. The room fell silent again, both of them consumed by their thoughts. Emily's mind raced with the implications of what he was asking, the potential fallout from every angle. Her loyalty to Michael, her moral compass, her sense of self. All of it felt fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, though his expression betrayed his impatience. "Take the time you need, but not too much. We don't have the luxury of waiting." Emily rose from her chair, her legs unsteady beneath her. She felt his eyes on her as she walked to the door, the weight of his gaze heavy and unrelenting. Her hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, and she turned back to face him. "This, what you're asking," she began, struggling to find the words. "It's not just about contracts and agreements, John. It's about people, about lives." "I know," he said, his voice quieter now. "But sometimes, Emily, the line between logic and emotion isn't as clear as we'd like it to be." That night, as Emily sat alone in her apartment, her thoughts returned to his words. The line between logic and emotion. It was a line she had walked her entire life, balancing practicality with her own desires and principles. But now, it felt like that line was crumbling beneath her feet, leaving her suspended in a void of uncertainty. She thought of Michael, of the love they had shared and the struggles that had worn them down. She thought of John, of his desperation and the surprising depth she had glimpsed in him. And she thought of herself, caught between two worlds, two lives, two impossible choices. The room around her felt unbearably quiet, the ticking of the clock loud and mocking. As she stared at the shadows dancing on the walls, Emily felt the weight of her decision bearing down on her, an unrelenting force that threatened to consume her. And yet, beneath the guilt, the doubt, the fear, there was something else, a faint, flickering ember of resolve. Whatever choice she made, It would shape her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But for now, all she could do was breathe and wait and hope that the right path would reveal itself in time. Emily sat at the edge of her bed, the faint hum of the heater filling the silence around her. The room was dim, illuminated only by the muted glow of the bedside lamp, which cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. The apartment felt smaller tonight, as if the weight of her decision was pressing the walls closer, suffocating her. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, as if holding herself together physically would stop her from unraveling mentally. Her thoughts spiraled endlessly, a chaotic loop of guilt, desperation, and fear. She tried to steady her breathing, but every time she closed her eyes, John's proposition echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. "I need you to have a child for me. It's just a business arrangement." A business arrangement. The words felt cold and clinical, yet they carried a weight that was anything but detached. How could something as monumental as bringing a child into the world be reduced to a transaction? And yet, wasn't that exactly what her life had become? A constant negotiation of sacrifices, survival, and compromise. Her gaze drifted toward the closed door of the bedroom where Michael was sleeping. The rise and fall of his shallow breaths were just audible, a fragile rhythm that tethered her to reality. She thought of his laughter, his warmth, and how their love had once been a fortress against the world's harshness. But now, that fortress felt like it was built on crumbling foundations, strained under the weight of his illness and their financial ruin. "I'm doing this for him," she told herself, for the 100th time, though the words rang hollow. Was it really for Michael? Or was it because she couldn't bear the helplessness, the gnawing fear of losing him, and the life they had built together? Her internal monologue fractured into fragments, each one cutting deeper than the last. If I say no, Michael might not survive. But if I say yes, will I survive what it will do to us? Would he hate me for it? Would he understand? Or is this the ultimate betrayal? Her chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, to break something, anything to shatter the oppressive silence that seemed to mock her indecision. But she sat, frozen, her hands gripping her knees like anchors. Emily's mind drifted back to her conversation with John earlier that day. His face had been inscrutable, his words calculated. But she had caught a glimpse of something beneath the surface. Desperation, vulnerability. He was a man used to control, yet in that moment, he had seemed as lost as she felt now. "Me?" she had asked him, her voice trembling. "Because I trust you," he had replied simply. That single word had disarmed her, left her with a confusing mix of emotions she couldn't untangle. Trust. It was such a strange thing to hear from a man like John, who guarded his life and his empire with an almost impenetrable wall. She had wanted to feel flattered, but instead it had made her feel trapped. And yet, a part of her understood him. They were both standing on precarious edges, bound by circumstances they couldn't fully control. But did that shared understanding justify what he was asking? Did it absolve her of the guilt that was now consuming her? The apartment seemed unnaturally quiet, as if it were holding its breath alongside her. Emily rose from the bed and walked toward the window, the cold wooden floor grounding her momentarily. She pulled the curtain back slightly, her eyes scanning the city below. The streets were alive with the glow of headlights and neon signs, the distant hum of life continuing as though nothing had changed. But for her, everything had changed. The city that had once felt vibrant now seemed indifferent, its lights harsh and unfeeling. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass, her reflection staring back at her. In the muted light, she barely recognized herself. The woman looking back seemed older, her features etched with worry and exhaustion. Where was the Emily who had faced life's challenges with resilience and hope? Was this what desperation looked like? Her thoughts turned to the child John wanted her to bear, a life created not from love or desire, but from necessity. She pictured the child's face, imagined holding them in her arms, and a pang of longing pierced through her. But alongside it came a wave of dread. How could she explain this to Michael? How could she look into her husband's eyes and admit what she had agreed to do? Her inner voice, relentless and cruel, whispered, "What kind of mother brings a child into the world like this?" Emily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms until the pain grounded her again. She didn't have the answers, and that terrified her more than anything. She felt like a ship caught in a storm, tossed between conflicting emotions, unable to find a safe harbor. Michael stirred in the other room, and the sound pulled her back to the present. She turned away from the window and hesitated before walking to the bedroom door. She pushed it open gently, the dim light from the hallway spilling into the room. Michael's face was peaceful in sleep, a stark contrast to the turmoil in her own mind. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand hovering over his before she finally rested it there. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Em?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she lied, her voice breaking slightly. "Just couldn't sleep." He shifted slightly, his hand weakly squeezing hers. "You don't have to carry everything alone, you know." His words were like a dagger to her heart. She wanted to tell him everything, to unburden herself and let him share in the weight of her decision, but she couldn't. Not yet. "I know," she whispered, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Go back to sleep." Michael's breathing evened out again, and Emily sat there for a long time, her hand still resting on his. Her mind screamed at her to make a choice, to take a stand, but her heart was too tangled in its own knots to find clarity. As dawn began to creep through the blinds, Emily finally rose and returned to the kitchen. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea. The bills on the counter caught her eye, their presence a cruel reminder of the reality she couldn't escape. "I can't do this," she thought, her chest tightening again. But almost immediately, another voice countered, "You don't have a choice." The contradiction tore at her, leaving her paralyzed. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as she wrestled with the impossible decision before her. Emily knew that whatever path she chose, it would leave scars on her, on Michael, and on the life they had built together. But as the first rays of sunlight warmed the cold kitchen, she realized one thing with painful clarity. She couldn't avoid the storm forever. Sooner or later, she would have to face it. And when she did, she could only hope that she wouldn't lose herself completely. The morning light filtered through the blinds, streaking the kitchen walls with pale golden lines, but to Emily it felt hollow, mocking even. The day had arrived, and with it, the weight of the decision she could no longer defer. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold mug of tea in her hands, her mind a whirlwind of emotions that refused to settle. The apartment was silent, except for the faint rustle of the city waking outside, a world oblivious to the storm brewing in her heart. "I accept." The words she had spoken the day before echoed in her mind, heavy and unrelenting. They had come out of her mouth almost without her permission, as though some part of her had already made the choice, dragging her conscious mind along reluctantly. "Did I really say that? Did I truly agree to this?" she questioned herself, though she already knew the answer. The papers were being drawn up, the arrangement would be finalized soon. Her acceptance had set the wheels in motion, and now there was no going back. Emily's heart felt like it was tearing itself apart, each beat pulling her in a different direction. She wanted to believe that she had chosen for the right reasons, for Michael, for their future, for the chance to claw her way out of the financial abyss, swallowing them whole. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had betrayed something fundamental within herself. Am I saving him or destroying us both? Her thoughts spiraled as her fingers traced the rim of her mug. Every reason she had clung to felt like sand slipping through her grasp. She thought of Michael, his gentle voice assuring her they would find a way, even as his body grew weaker with every passing day. She thought of the life they had shared before the illness, a life filled with laughter and quiet joy. And now, she was preparing to shatter that life with a secret too big to contain. Emily's reflection in the kitchen window caught her eye. The woman staring back was tired, drawn, and unrecognizable. Her eyes, once bright with determination, were now shadowed with doubt and fear. She remembered the person she used to be, the version of herself who would have never considered something like this. But that Emily hadn't been faced with the impossible, hadn't been backed into a corner with no escape. "You're doing what you have to do," she told herself, trying to muster conviction. "You're doing this for him." But the guilt rose up like a tide, threatening to drown her. Was she really doing this for Michael? Or had her own fear of failure, of losing him, of being left with nothing, pushed her into this? Her fingers tightened around the mug, the porcelain cool against her skin, grounding her in the moment. A creak from the bedroom broke the silence, and Michael appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame for support. He looked fragile, his once strong frame now gaunt, but his smile when he saw her was warm, untouched by the weight of her secret. "Morning," he said softly, his voice hoarse but kind. Emily forced a smile, though it felt like a lie. "Morning. Coffee's ready if you want some." Michael shuffled to the table and sat across from her, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out, his hand brushing hers. "You've been so quiet lately," he said, his tone gentle but concerned. "What's going on, Em? Is it the bills again?" Her chest tightened at his question. The bills. Always the bills. They had become a constant presence in their lives, an unyielding reminder of their struggle. She wanted to tell him the truth, to let him in on the impossible choice she had made, but the words wouldn't come. "It's just work," she lied, her voice too quick, too rehearsed. "You know how it gets." Michael studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed. He had always been able to see through her, but now he seemed too tired to press further. Instead, he nodded and squeezed her hand. "Whatever it is," he said, "you don't have to carry it alone. I'm still here, even if I can't do as much as I used to." Emily's heart twisted painfully. If only he knew what she was carrying. As the day wore on, Emily found herself returning to John's words. "I need you to have a child for me. It's just a contract." The simplicity of the statement belied the enormity of what it meant. It wasn't just a contract, it was a life. It was a decision that would ripple through her marriage, her identity, her future. She had tried to convince herself that it was logical, that it was the only way to solve her problems, but the logic felt cold and hollow now, and her heart ached with the weight of the moral compromise she had made. That evening, Emily found herself standing outside on the balcony, the chill of the air biting at her skin. The city stretched out before her, a sea of lights and motion, each window a world unto itself. She wondered how many people out there were grappling with decisions like hers, how many lives were teetering on the brink of something irreversible. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint buzz of her phone. It was a message from John. "The agreement is ready. We can proceed tomorrow." Emily stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Tomorrow. The final step. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down, unable to bring herself to reply. The hours crept by, and when Emily finally lay down beside Michael, the weight of her decision pressed against her like a physical force. She stared at the ceiling, the cracks forming shapes she couldn't decipher as her mind replayed every possible outcome. What if he finds out? She wondered, her stomach knotting at the thought. What if this destroys us? But another voice, quieter yet insistent, whispered, "What if it saves him?" She turned onto her side, watching Michael's chest rise and fall in the faint light of the room. He was her anchor, her reason for fighting, and yet the fight itself had led her to this crossroads where every path seemed fraught with loss. When morning came, Emily dressed in silence, her movements mechanical. The decision had been made, but it still felt unreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. She kissed Michael's forehead before leaving, her lips lingering as if trying to imprint the moment into her memory. As she walked to John's office, the city seemed brighter, almost oblivious to the turmoil inside her. The sunlight felt harsh against her skin, the noise of traffic too loud, too alive. By the time she arrived, her heart was pounding in her chest, a relentless drumbeat that refused to be ignored. John greeted her with his usual composed demeanor, but she saw something in his eyes, anticipation, perhaps even relief. He handed her the contract, his voice calm and measured. "Are you ready?" he asked. Emily hesitated, her hands trembling as she took the pen. She stared at the paper, the lines of legal jargon blurring together. This was it, the moment her choice became reality. "I'm ready," she said finally, though her voice barely felt like her own. As she signed her name, a single tear slipped down her cheek, unnoticed by John but burning against her skin. The atmosphere in John's office felt heavier than usual as Emily sat across from him, the contract lying on the polished surface of his desk. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Emily's fingers hovered over the pen, her pulse hammering in her ears as she read the words again, though their meaning was already seared into her mind. John's gaze was steady, his posture as composed as ever, but there was something in his expression, an undercurrent of tension, that betrayed the weight of this moment for him as well. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual edge, "you don't have to go through this again. If you have questions, ask. If you're uncertain..." He trailed off, a rare hesitation in his words. Emily looked up, her eyes meeting his. She wanted to believe that his concern was genuine, but the stakes for him were too high. His calmness, his calculated patience. It wasn't just about her. It was about securing his legacy, solidifying the future he had worked so relentlessly to protect. "I've read it," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I understand what I'm agreeing to." John nodded, his face an unreadable mask, but Emily noticed the slight tightening of his jaw. He reached for a glass of water on his desk, his hand steady but deliberate, as though the simple act was a way to anchor himself. "This arrangement," he began, setting the glass down carefully, "requires clarity, no misunderstandings, no room for doubt." Emily felt a flicker of irritation at his words. "I think we're both clear on what this is," she replied, her tone sharper than she intended. "You need an heir. I need the money. It's not exactly complicated." John's eyes narrowed slightly, but instead of the retort she expected, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Ugh, it's not complicated," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it's not simple either." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Emily wondered if he was speaking to her or to himself. The agreement was signed that day. and the ink felt heavier than any she'd ever put to paper. The clinical nature of the process, the notarized pages, the legal jargon, the witness signatures, was a stark contrast to the emotional storm raging within her. Emily walked out of John's office feeling hollow, the weight of her decision pressing down with every step. The ride home was a blur. The city rushed past her, a whirlwind of color and sound that barely registered. By the time she reached her apartment, she felt like a ghost, drifting through the motions of her life. Michael was asleep when she entered, his labored breathing the only sound in the room. Emily stood by the door, her heart aching at the sight of him. This was for him, she reminded herself. For his treatment, his survival. But the thought brought little comfort. Instead, it felt like a thin shield against the rising tide of guilt and fear. The procedure was scheduled quickly, too quickly for Emily to fully process what was happening. The sterile white walls of the clinic felt like a prison as she sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. John was across from her, his presence as steady as ever, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. He wasn't as unaffected as he wanted her to believe. "You sure about this?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost soft, and for a moment Emily thought she saw something like concern in his eyes. "I don't think 'sure' is the right word," she replied. Her tone clipped. "But I've made my choice." John nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "There was no turning back the moment I signed that contract." He didn't respond, and the silence between them stretched, heavy and fraught with unspoken doubts. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's life began to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. The first signs of pregnancy came with a wave of nausea that left her feeling both fragile and grounded in the reality of what was happening. The symptoms were a constant reminder of the life growing within her, a life that wasn't meant to be hers, not truly. John, too, began to change. At first, his concern seemed practical, almost transactional. He called often, asking about her health, ensuring that her needs were met. But over time, his questions grew more personal, his tone less detached. "How are you feeling today?" he asked one evening, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Emily hesitated, the warmth in his words catching her off guard. "Tired," she admitted finally, "and nauseous. But that's normal, right?" "It is," John replied. There was a pause, and then he added, "If you need anything at all, you let me know." Emily didn't know how to respond. She had expected distance, professionalism, but this felt different. As she told herself it was nothing, just his way of ensuring the success of their arrangement. But the way he looked at her sometimes, with a quiet intensity she couldn't quite place, made her question everything. At home, things with Michael grew more strained. He noticed her exhaustion, her frequent absences, and though he didn't press her for answers, the unspoken tension between them grew with every passing day. Emily found herself lying more often, each excuse weighing heavier than the last. One night, as they lay in bed, Michael turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been different lately, Em. Distant." Emily's heart ached at his words, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. "I'm just tired," she said, forcing a smile. "Work's been overwhelming."
Michael studied her for a moment, his eyes filled with worry and something else, something closer to suspicion, but he said nothing more. and Emily felt the gulf between them widen.
As the months went on, Emily found herself spending more time with John. They met regularly for updates, but their conversations often drifted beyond the practicalities of the arrangement. She learned about his childhood, his strange relationship with his father, and the loneliness that seemed to shadow him despite his success. "You must think I'm a monster," he said one evening, his tone uncharacteristically vulnerable. Emily looked at him, startled by the admission. "Why would I think that?" "For asking you to do this," he said simply, "for putting you in this position." She hesitated, the honesty in his words disarming her. "It's not that simple," she replied. "None of this is. The cameras are in on us." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade. In that fleeting connection, Emily saw a side of John she hadn't expected, a man burdened by his own choices, his own regrets. It didn't erase the pain of what they were doing, but it made it harder to hate him for it. The agreement had been meant to solve their problems, to provide clarity and purpose, but instead it had become a labyrinth of emotions, a tangle of guilt, doubt, and unexpected connections. Emily felt herself changing, her once clear sense of right and wrong blurring with each passing day. And John, despite his best efforts to remain detached, seemed to be changing too. The lines between their roles, "You know what a lovebird is doing in my yard," were blurring together, began to blur, leaving them both grappling with feelings neither had anticipated.
As the due date loomed closer, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the fragile pact they had formed was about to be tested in ways neither of them could foresee. The tension in Emily's apartment had become suffocating, an invisible fog that clouded every interaction between her and Michael. Each passing day seemed to widen the gap between them, their once effortless connection now a fragile thread strained under the weight of secrets. Emily found herself avoiding his gaze, her heart sinking each time his eyes lingered on her for a moment too long.
One evening, as she stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables, Michael appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful but lined with exhaustion. His voice, though soft, carried an unmistakable undercurrent of suspicion. "You've been gone a lot lately," he said, his tone measured. "And when you're here, it's like you're not really here." Emily froze, her knife stilling mid-chop. Her breath hitched, and she forced herself to focus on the rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the cutting board. Work's been overwhelming," she said after a pause, her voice carefully neutral. Michael stepped closer, his brows furrowed. "Emily, I know you. You're not just tired. Something's wrong." He reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. "Talk to me." Her heart ached at his touch, at the concern in his eyes. She wanted to tell him everything, to unburden herself of the guilt that had been eating away at her for months. But the words caught in her throat, choked by fear. Fear of losing him, of shattering the life they had built together. "There's nothing to talk about," she said finally, pulling her arm away. "I'm fine, Michael. Just let it go." His expression darkened, the hurt flashing in his eyes before he turned away. "Fine," he said quietly, retreating to the living room. The sound of the TV turning on filled the silence, but it did little to mask the growing distance between them. The tension wasn't confined to her apartment. It followed Emily to every meeting with John, where the lines of their agreement continued to blur. At first, their conversations had been strictly business, updates on her health, plans for the future. But as time went on, John's questions became more personal, his demeanor softer, more human. "How are you feeling?" he asked one afternoon, his voice tinged with genuine concern as they sat in his office. Emily hesitated, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. "Tired," she admitted, "and, overwhelmed." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a lot to carry, more than I realized when I asked you to do this." She looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. For all his calculated demeanor, there were moments like these when he seemed almost regretful.
"Do you regret it?" she asked before she could stop herself.
John's eyes met hers, and for a moment she thought he might deflect the question. But instead, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I thought this would be simple, a solution to a problem, but nothing about this feels simple anymore." His words mirrored her own feelings, and the unspoken connection between them tightened like a noose around her resolve. She hated how much she understood him, how much his struggle resonated with her own. As her pregnancy progressed, Emily found it harder to maintain the facade of normalcy. Her body betrayed her with subtle changes, an unfamiliar softness to her figure, a glow that drew attention she didn't want. Michael noticed too, though he said nothing, his silence more damning than any accusation. One evening, as she sat on the couch with her feet propped up, Michael sat beside her. He didn't speak at first, his gaze fixed on the TV. But then he turned to her, his expression a mix of sadness and frustration. "Are we okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Emily's chest tightened, her heart pounding in her ears. "Of course we are," she replied, forcing a smile that felt brittle. Michael shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You don't mean that. You've been distant, secretive. It's like I don't even know you anymore." The words cut deeper than she expected, leaving her breathless. She wanted to tell him the truth, to explain everything. But the thought of his reaction, of the hurt and betrayal she would see in his eyes, paralyzed her. "I'm doing my best," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I'm trying, Michael."
He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, though it was clear he wasn't convinced. "I hope that's true," he said softly before leaving the room.
Meanwhile, John's involvement in her life grew more complicated. He began attending her doctor's appointments, a gesture she wasn't sure was meant to show care or control. Each time he asked her about the baby, his tone carried an unexpected warmth that left her unsettled. "How's the little one today?" he asked during one visit, his hand hovering awkwardly near her stomach before pulling back. Emily forced a smile, her emotions a tangled mess. "Fine, I think. Everything's progressing as it should." John nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Good. It's good." The room fell into an awkward silence, the weight of their arrangement pressing down on them. Emily could feel the tension in his gaze, the unspoken emotions that neither of them dared to address. The breaking point came during a family dinner with Michael's parents. Emily had been dreading it for weeks, knowing the questions would come, knowing she wouldn't have the answers they wanted.
"You're glowing," Michael's mother said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Emily. "Is there something you're not telling us?"
Emily froze, her fork clattering against her plate. Michael's eyes darted to hers, suspicion flashing across his face. "No," she said quickly, forcing a laugh. "I've just been, eating better." Michael's father chuckled, oblivious to the tension. "Well, whatever it is, it suits you." Michael didn't laugh, he didn't say anything. His silence was louder than any words, and Emily felt her chest tighten as the weight of her secret threatened to crush her. That night, as she lay in bed beside Michael, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. The tension between them had reached a boiling point, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Her thoughts drifted to John, to the growing bond between them that she didn't want to acknowledge. She hated how complicated it had all become, how her feelings for him, unwanted and unwelcome, had begun to creep into her thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen, she told herself, her hands resting on her stomach. None of this was supposed to happen. But it had, and now she was trapped, caught between two lives, two men, and a decision that would change everything. The tension was unbearable, and yet Emily knew it was only the beginning. The truth couldn't stay hidden forever, and when it came to light, it would leave nothing untouched.
The truth came to light in a moment of devastating clarity, unraveling the fragile threads that had kept their tenuous arrangement intact. John Callahan stood in his office, the crumpled DNA test results clenched in his fist. His usually impenetrable composure cracked, revealing an undercurrent of raw anger and betrayal.
The results confirmed his worst fears. The child wasn't his. Emily stood before him, her face pale, her hands trembling. The silence between them was suffocating, charged with a tension that threatened to shatter the room. "You lied to me," John said finally, his voice low and laced with quiet fury. His words were measured, but the storm in his eyes spoke volumes. "After everything, you lied." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry as she searched for the right words. But what could she say to a man who had trusted her, who had built his future on a foundation that was now crumbling beneath his feet? I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how to tell you." John's laughter was bitter, sharp. "You didn't know how to tell me?" he repeated, his tone incredulous. "So you decided to keep it a secret? To let me believe—" He broke off, his voice faltering, his anger giving way to something deeper, more painful. Emily flinched at his words, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't do this to hurt you, John. I did it for Michael. He needed the money, the treatments." "Don't," John interrupted, his voice cutting through hers like a knife. "Don't you dare justify this as some noble act. You used me, Emily. You used my desperation, my trust, and you—" He stopped, his breath hitching, the betrayal too fresh to articulate. The office felt like a battleground, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Emily's guilt was palpable, pressing down on her like an iron weight. She wanted to explain, to make him understand, but every word that came to mind felt hollow, inadequate. "I didn't know what else to do," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael was dying. The bills, they were piling up, and You decided to bring a child into this mess?" John snapped, his anger flaring again. "Do you even understand what you've done? You've not only lied to me, but you've brought an innocent life into a situation built on deceit and manipulation." Emily's tears spilled over, streaking down her cheeks as she nodded. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I've made mistakes, but I didn't see another way. I thought this would fix everything." John let out a harsh laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Fix everything?" he repeated, shaking his head. "Emily, you've destroyed everything." The confrontation left them both reeling, the foundation of their relationship, whatever it had been, shattered. But the repercussions extended beyond their private confrontation. The news of the scandal spread quickly thanks to Claudia, John's calculating sister. She had been waiting for a moment of weakness, and this revelation was the perfect weapon. The tabloids were ruthless, splashing headlines across their pages. "Callahan heir scandal, billionaire betrayed by surrogate," and "corporate deception or personal tragedy, the Callahan scandal unfolds." John's reputation, carefully constructed over decades, began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Investors pulled out. Shareholders demanded answers, and the Callahan empire teetered on the brink of collapse. Emily, too, faced the fallout. Her once quiet life was now a storm of reporters, whispered judgments, and strained relationships. Michael's reaction had been both heartbreaking and predictable. That evening, when Emily returned home, Michael was waiting for her. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. He had seen the headlines. She could tell by the way he avoided her gaze, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. "Is the baby not his?" Emily's breath caught in her throat, the question hanging in the air like a guillotine. She nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's true," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "The baby isn't his." Michael closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath as he processed her words. When he opened them again, they were filled with a pain that cut straight through her. "Why, Emily?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" She reached out to him, her hands trembling. "I wanted to protect you," she said, her voice desperate. "I wanted to save us." Michael stepped back, shaking his head. "Save us?" he repeated, his tone incredulous. "You think this saved us? You've lied to me, to him, to yourself. You've made everything worse." His words were a knife to her heart, but she knew he was right. She had made her choices, and now she had to face their consequences. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of damage control. John held press conferences, his polished demeanor masking the turmoil beneath. He stood before the cameras, addressing the scandal with a calm authority that belied the chaos behind the scenes. "Yes, there have been personal challenges," he said, his voice steady. "But I want to make one thing clear. This child, regardless of circumstances, is my responsibility. I will not let this situation define them, or the legacy of Callahan Industries." Emily watched from the sidelines, her heart aching as she saw the toll it took on him. He had every right to hate her, to cut her out of his life entirely, but instead he had chosen to protect the child, to shield them from the storm they had created. Their relationship, however, was irrevocably changed. When they spoke, their conversations were terse, filled with unspoken tensions and unresolved emotions. John's once soft concern had hardened into a distant professionalism, a barrier she couldn't penetrate. "How are you feeling?" he asked during one of their rare meetings, his tone clipped. "Fine," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "The baby's fine." "Good," he said, nodding briskly. "That's all that matters." But it wasn't all that mattered. Beneath his cold exterior, Emily could see the cracks, the pain, the anger, the betrayal that still lingered. And she felt it too, the weight of their shared choices pressing down on her like a stone. In the quiet moments when she was alone, Emily replayed their confrontation over and over again. She thought of John's face when he had learned the truth, the way his anger had given way to something deeper, more devastating. She thought of Michael's hurt, his disappointment, and the chasm that had grown between them. And she thought of the child, the life she had brought into the world under circumstances that now felt unbearably heavy. Would they grow up resenting her? Would they feel the weight of the choices she had made before they were even born? The reveal had shattered their lives, but it had also forced them to confront truths they had both tried to ignore. For John, it was the realization that his legacy was more than just an empire. It was the people he chose to build it with. For Emily, it was the understanding that her decisions, however well-intentioned, carried consequences she couldn't escape. As the months passed, they began to rebuild, not as they were before, but as something new, something fragile but resilient. And though the scars of their choices would never fully fade, they found a way to move forward, bound by the life they had created and the lessons they had learned. The months following the scandal were marked by upheaval, reflection, and reluctant rebuilding. The damage to their lives, both public and private, was undeniable. Yet, amidst the wreckage, glimmers of hope began to emerge. John, Emily, and Michael were forced to confront their broken relationships, their flawed decisions, and the consequences of their actions. What emerged wasn't a perfect resolution, but a testament to resilience, love, and the strength of the human spirit. Emily held her newborn son in her arms, his tiny hand wrapped tightly around her finger. The hospital room was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of morning light streaming through the window. For the first time in months, Emily felt a semblance of peace. She gazed at the baby's face, marveling at his innocence, his untouched purity. He was a reminder of everything that had been lost and everything that could still be salvaged. Michael entered the room, his movements hesitant but purposeful. He had been distant since the truth came out, but something in his demeanor had softened over the weeks. He sat down beside Emily, his eyes fixed on the baby. "What's his name?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with both curiosity and vulnerability. Emily hesitated, her throat tightening. She hadn't chosen a name yet, unsure of what felt right after everything they had been through. "I was waiting," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. I wanted us to decide together." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. But then he reached out, gently stroking the baby's cheek. "How about Nathan?" he suggested after a moment. "It means gift." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and she nodded. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's perfect." For the first time in months, a tentative smile crossed Michael's face, and Emily felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the beginning of healing, a small step toward mending the fractures in their lives. John visited later that afternoon. His presence in the hospital room was a strange juxtaposition to Michael's earlier tenderness. He stood by the door, his usually confident posture subdued, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. Emily motioned for him to come closer, and he approached hesitantly, his eyes fixed on the baby. "So this is him?" John said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of wonder and sadness. Emily nodded, her grip on Nathan tightening slightly. "This is Nathan." John crouched down beside the chair, his gaze softening as he studied the baby's face. "He's beautiful," he murmured, "and strong, I can tell." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. John straightened, his eyes meeting Emily's. Thank you," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "For giving him a chance, for, everything." Emily swallowed hard, her heart aching at the sincerity in his tone. "You don't have to thank me, John," she replied. "We both made choices, and now we have to live with them." He nodded, his jaw tightening briefly before he spoke again. "I want to be a part of his life, Emily. Whatever that looks like, whatever you're comfortable with. I need to be there for him." Emily's eyes searched his, and she saw the depth of his sincerity, the quiet determination that defined him. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, "for Nathan's sake." The days turned into weeks, and slowly a new dynamic began to take shape. John's involvement in Nathan's life grew cautiously, carefully balanced with Michael's presence as Emily worked to navigate the complex web of relationships. There were moments of tension, moments when the past threatened to rear its head and unravel everything. But there were also moments of grace, of connection, where they found common ground in their shared love for Nathan. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Emily sat on the porch of her apartment, Nathan cradled in her arms. Michael joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea, the steam curling upward in the cool evening air. "You've been quiet today," Michael said, handing her a mug and sitting beside her. Emily smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Just thinking," she replied, "about how much has changed, about what's ahead." Michael took a sip of his tea, his eyes studying her face. "We've been through a lot," he said, "but we're still here. That has to count for something." Emily turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know how to make it right," she admitted. "I don't know how to fix us." Michael reached out, placing a hand over hers. "Maybe we don't have to fix everything all at once," he said. "Maybe we just take it one day at a time, for us, for Nathan." His words were a balm to her aching heart, a reminder that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey. She nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "One day at a time," she echoed. John too found himself changed by the experience. The man who had once valued control above all else now learned to embrace vulnerability, to open himself to the unpredictable nature of human connection. He spent afternoons with Nathan, marveling at the baby's curious gaze, the small fingers that clutched at his own with surprising strength. One afternoon, as he held Nathan in his arms, Claudia appeared in his office. She had been distant since the scandal, her usual sharp demeanor muted. She watched him for a moment before speaking.
"You've surprised me, John," she said, her tone softer than usual. "I didn't think you'd handle this like this." John looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But sometimes life doesn't give us a choice. It just happens, and we have to figure it out."
Claudia nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Maybe you're not as cold-hearted as I thought." John chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't let that get out. I have a reputation to maintain." The months turned into a year, and slowly, the fractures in their lives began to heal. Emily and Michael found a new rhythm, their relationship rebuilt on honesty and a shared commitment to Nathan. John became a steady presence in their lives, his role as Nathan's father one of quiet strength and unwavering love. At Nathan's first birthday party, the apartment was filled with laughter and warmth. Friends and family gathered, their joy a testament to the resilience that had carried them through the darkest times. John stood beside Emily and Michael, a sense of peace settling over him as he watched Nathan reach for his cake with chubby hands. In that moment, the past seemed to fade, its sharp edges dulled by the light of the present. They weren't perfect, and their journey wasn't over, but they were together, bound by love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable strength of family. And that, Emily thought, was enough for Nathan, for all of them.